She looked perfect, the kind of perfect that took 2 hours, a waist-cinching blue dress, and a smile held together by sheer willpower. The hallway of Sterling Mansion felt suffocatingly quiet, every portrait watching her like it knew her marriage was already falling apart. Elena stopped at the mirror, fixing a loose strand of hair. She needed to look like a woman attending a gala, not a woman pretending her husband hadn't stopped touching her months ago. The oak doors opened. A man stepped in, sharp-jawed, calm, dangerous. He didn't belong to the crowd downstairs. He looked like the kind of man who already knew how the night would end. He stopped beside her. "The gala is downstairs," she whispered. "I know. Then why are you up here?" He finally looked at her. "Because," he said quietly, "your husband is upstairs with my wife." The gala was a blur of gold-leafed ceilings and the rhythmic clinking of crystal, a hollow symphony that Elena usually orchestrated with practiced ease. In her light blue evening dress, she was the picture of poise, a carefully curated masterpiece designed to reflect her husband's rising status. She had spent the last hour navigating the crowd, smiling until her cheeks ached, always playing the part of the supportive wife to a man who was currently networking in the shadows. Seeking a momentary reprieve from the heat of the ballroom, she slipped into the West Wing hallway. It was a space of heavy oak and silence, illuminated by the warm glow of recessed lighting that made the polished wooden staircase look like a path to another world. Elena stopped before a gilded mirror, the silence of the corridor pressing against her ears. She caught her reflection, the elegant tuck of her dark hair, the shimmer of her drop earrings. But beneath the silk and sparkle, her eyes were wide, betraying a frantic pulse she couldn't quite settle. She reached up to smooth a stray lock of hair, her fingers trembling. She told herself it was just the exhaustion of the social season, the weight of a performance that never seemed to end. The heavy thud of the oak doors at the far end of the hall broke her concentration. A man stepped into the light, moving with a grounded, athletic certainty that felt entirely out of place among the fluttering socialites downstairs. He wore a black tailored suit, his white shirt open at the collar in a way that signaled a total lack of interest in the evening's formalities. As he approached, his sharp jawline and focused gaze gave him the air of a man who didn't just walk into rooms, but commanded them. He didn't head for the bar or the balcony. Instead, he stopped just a few feet from her, his eyes fixed on the diagonal line of the staircase leading upward. The silence between them grew heavy, a physical thing that made the air feel thick and difficult to breathe. Elena watched him through the mirror, her hand still frozen near her throat. He wasn't looking at her reflection. He was looking at the landing above, his lips pressed into a thin, grim line. Elena felt the familiar reflex to fill the void, the nervous chatter her mother always warned her about. "The main event is in the ballroom," she said, her voice sounding thin and fragile in the vast hallway. He didn't turn his head. His gaze remained locked on the upstairs door, where a sliver of golden light spilled onto the carpet. "I'm not here for the event," he replied, his voice a low, controlled rumble that vibrated in the small space between them. "Then you're lost," Elena tried, attempting to reclaim her footing as the master of the house. He finally looked at her then, his eyes narrowed and intense. "I know exactly where I am," he said, stepping closer until the scent of cedar and cold air enveloped her. "And I know where they are. Your husband is upstairs, with my wife." The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged, like shattered glass. Elena didn't move. She couldn't. The hand she had used to smooth her hair remained hovering near her temple, her fingers trembling against the cool skin of her forehead. In the gilded mirror, she watched her own reflection. The wide, disbelieving eyes and the way her mouth had fallen slightly open in a silent gasp. She wanted to laugh, to dismiss him as a drunk or a cruel prankster, but the man standing beside her was too still, his intensity too cold for a joke. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely a thread. "My husband is downstairs. He's with the board members. He's in the master suite," Marcus interrupted, his voice devoid of pity. "And he didn't go there to talk about quarterly earnings." He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket. The movement was slow and deliberate, designed to give her a final moment of ignorance before everything changed forever. He pulled out a small rectangular object, a phone with a cracked screen, and a delicate gold chain that dangled from his fingers. Elena's heart skipped a beat, then began to hammer against her ribs with a violence that made her feel faint. She recognized the necklace immediately. It was a custom-made piece, a gold bar engraved with coordinates, one she had seen draped around the neck of Julian's junior associate at the last 3 charity functions. But it was the phone Marcus held out to her that carried the real weight of proof. He swiped the screen, the blue light illuminating the sharp lines of his face and the controlled anger in his eyes. He didn't hand it to her. He held it just close enough for her to read. It was a message thread, the timestamps from only 20 minutes ago. "The door is unlocked. I'm waiting in the room with the balcony. Don't let anyone see you." The reply was a single word, sent from a number Elena knew by heart, the number she called every night when he was working late. "Coming." The breath left Elena's lungs in a sharp, painful hiss. She leaned forward, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob that felt like it was tearing through her throat. The professional invisibility she had spent years perfecting, the grace she wore like armor, vanished in an instant. She was no longer a high society wife at a gala. She was a woman standing in a hallway, staring at the digital wreckage of her life. Marcus watched her, his posture upright and protective, yet he offered no empty comforts. He didn't reach out to steady her. He simply waited for her to process the clinical reality of the betrayal. The golden light from the upstairs door seemed to pulse now, no longer a warm invitation but a spotlight on a crime scene. "They think the noise from the ballroom is enough of a cover," Marcus said, his gaze shifting back to the staircase. "They think we're too busy playing our parts downstairs to notice they've stopped playing theirs." Elena looked from the phone to the wooden stairs. Every step looked like a mountain. The shame was a physical weight, a cold leaden feeling in her stomach, but beneath it, a spark of something sharper began to flicker. It was the same analytical focus she used to manage her family's social calendar, now turned toward a much darker task. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice cracking but gaining a sudden, desperate edge. "Why not just go up there yourself?" Marcus tucked the phone back into his pocket, his jaw tightening. "Because I don't just want a confrontation, Elena. I want the truth to be undeniable. And for that, I need the person they least expect to see standing behind that door." Elena looked at the staircase. To anyone else in the ballroom, it was merely an architectural masterpiece of mahogany and gold leaf, a grand stage for social climbing. To her, in this moment, it looked like a gallows. She shifted her weight, the silk of her light blue dress rustling with a sound that seemed deafening in the heavy silence of the hallway. Beside her, Marcus didn't offer a hand or a comforting word. He simply turned toward the first step, his presence a silent command for her to follow. The first step felt like a betrayal of her own legs. She placed a silver-heeled foot onto the polished wood, the sharp click echoing off the high ceilings. From the foyer below, the muffled roar of the gala continued. The mindless laughter of women she called friends and the booming voices of men Julian called brothers. They were all down there, drinking vintage champagne and celebrating a world that, for Elena, had just evaporated. She kept her gaze fixed on the back of Marcus's tailored jacket, using his steady, rhythmic pace as a tether to keep from collapsing. As they reached the midpoint of the ascent, the perspective shifted. Through the ornate balustrades, she could see the top of the grand chandelier, its thousands of crystals vibrating with the bass of the music downstairs. She felt an irrational urge to stop, to turn around and run back into the crowd, to pretend she had never stepped into this hallway or met this man with the cracked phone. If she stayed on these stairs, if she reached that landing, there would be no going back to the professionally invisible life she had curated so carefully. There would be no more polite lies over brunch or coordinated outfits for the Christmas cards. Marcus paused for a fraction of a second, his eyes scanning the hallway below to ensure they remained unobserved. The controlled dominance he radiated was the only thing keeping the air in her lungs. He moved with the quiet ease of a predator, his shadow stretching long and thin across the wooden risers. Elena followed, her hand trailing lightly, barely touching the banister. She felt like a ghost haunting her own life, watching the blurred silhouettes of the gala guests through the gaps in the railing. They looked like miniature dolls in a gilded cage, blissfully unaware of the storm gathering 10 feet above their heads. The higher they climbed, the colder the air seemed to become, stripped of the ballroom's artificial warmth. The scent of expensive floor wax and old money was replaced by something more intimate, more suffocating. The faint, lingering trail of the junior associate's perfume. It was a scent Elena recognized, a floral note that now felt like a physical blow to her chest. They reached the top landing. The wooden floor here was covered by a thick, cream-colored runner that swallowed the sound of their footsteps, plunging them into a sudden, vacuum-like quiet. Ahead of them, the hallway stretched toward the master suite. At the very end, a door stood ajar, a sliver of warm, golden light spilling onto the carpet like a taunt. Elena stopped, her breath coming in shallow, jagged hitches. Her hand flew to her mouth again, her wide eyes locked on that sliver of light. This was the bridge between her past and her future, a few feet of carpet that felt like a mile of broken glass. Marcus stood beside her, his upright posture and tense energy forming a protective wall between her and the hallway. He didn't look at her. He looked at the door, his jaw set in a line of grim finality. The ascent was over. Now there was only the truth. The cream-colored runner beneath their feet felt like sinking sand, muffling the world until the only sound left was the ragged, uneven rhythm of Elena's own breathing. They moved down the upstairs corridor, a space usually reserved for the private, quiet moments of a marriage, the late-night conversations and the shared morning routines that Elena had believed were sacred. Now, the hallway felt like a long, cold tunnel leading toward an inevitable collision. Marcus stopped a few paces from the master suite, his hand extending slightly to signal Elena to do the same. He didn't need to speak. The truth was already manifesting in the sliver of golden light cutting across the dark carpet. Elena leaned slightly forward, her posture tense, her body reacting with a visceral instinct to see what her mind was still trying to deny. Through the narrow gap of the partially open door, the interior of the room was bathed in a warm, amber glow that felt offensively cozy. The lighting was cinematic, casting long, soft shadows against the far wall, But the focus of the scene was the two figures standing near the foot of the bed. From this distance, and through the angle of the door, they were nothing more than blurred silhouettes, soft-edged shapes that blended into one another. Elena's eyes widened, her eyebrows rising in a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. She watched as one silhouette, taller and broader, unmistakably Julian, reached out. The other figure, slighter and more delicate, moved closer until the space between them vanished. They were standing so close that their outlines merged, a silent tableau of intimacy that shattered the last of Elena's defenses. There was no mistaking the tilt of the woman's head or the way Julian's hand rested on her waist with a familiarity that had once belonged solely to Elena. The hand Elena had pressed against her mouth began to shake so violently that she had to grip her jaw to keep from crying out. This wasn't a rumor whispered in a powder room or a suspicious text message read in the dark. This was the physical manifestation of her displacement. The shadows she had been chasing for months had finally taken form, and they were glowing in the warmth of her own home. Beside her, Marcus remained a pillar of controlled, intense energy. He didn't look away, and he didn't allow her to look away. He stood in a protective stance, his eyes fixed on the doorway with a gaze that was clinical yet simmering with a quiet fury. He was the truth holder, the man who had forced her to look at the blurred edges of her life until they became sharp, jagged realities. The silence of the hallway was punctuated by a low, muffled laugh from inside the room, a sound so casual and light-hearted that it felt like a physical blow to Elena's chest. It was the sound of a secret life flourishing while hers was being dismantled just a few feet away. She felt frozen, caught in the bridge of tension between the hallway and the room, between the woman she was 5 minutes ago and the woman she was becoming. The golden light spilling from the door felt like an accusation, exposing the fragility of her perfect world and the depth of the betrayal that had been hiding in plain sight. The muffled laughter from behind the door sharpened into a jagged blade, twisting in the space where Elena's pride used to live. She remained paralyzed, her heels sinking into the plush cream runner, as if the house itself were trying to swallow her whole. Her hand was still clamped over her mouth, her fingers digging into her cheeks with enough force to leave marks, but she couldn't feel the pain. All she could feel was the sudden, violent urge to turn and bolt back down the stairs, to lose herself in the mindless chatter of the gala and pretend this hallway was merely a bad dream brought on by too much champagne. If she ran now, she could maintain the lie. She could go back to being the envied wife of a powerful man, sleeping in a bed of expensive linens and hollow promises. She could keep the professional invisibility that had protected her for years, navigating their social circle with a scripted smile while her heart quietly withered. The stairs were right there, a diagonal escape route back to a world where she was still the woman in the light blue dress, not the woman in the shadows. But as she looked at Marcus, she saw the reflection of her own burgeoning resolve. He stood like a sentinel, his posture upright and his gaze unyielding. He wasn't running. He was waiting for the moment the performance ended and the truth began. Elena realized then that the perfection she had been polishing in the mirror downstairs was a cage. Every strand of hair she had smoothed and every rehearsed excuse she had prepared was just a bar she had helped build. The struggle inside her was a silent, frantic war. One side of her mind screamed for the safety of the dark, while the other, the side that had noticed the missing cufflink, the late-night office calls, and the coldness in Julian's touch, demanded the light. She took a shallow, shuddering breath, the scent of that floral perfume acting like a catalyst. The shock in her eyes began to harden into something sharper, something more dangerous. The hand covering her mouth slowly dropped to her side, her fingers curling into a tight, tense fist. She didn't want to run anymore. The fear was still there, a cold weight in her stomach, but it was being overtaken by a desperate, searing need to know the full extent of the betrayal. She needed to see the faces behind the blurred silhouettes. She needed to hear the words they spoke when they thought no one was listening. Elena leaned slightly forward, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the sliver of golden light. The bridge of tension between the hallway and the room felt like it was humming, vibrating with the energy of a secret about to burst. She looked at Marcus, a silent understanding passing between them. He recognized the shift, the moment the victim became a witness. He adjusted his stance, a calm but tense energy radiating from him, ready to move whenever she was. The frozen moment was thawing, and in its place was a cold, crystalline clarity. She wasn't going back down those stairs as the woman she used to be. The only way out was through the door. The silence of the hallway was finally broken by the sound of Elena's own movement. It wasn't a loud noise, just the soft, decisive click of her silver heels making contact with the hardwood as she bridged the final few feet of the cream-colored runner. Every ounce of the professionally invisible persona she had cultivated for years fell away, replaced by a cold, crystalline focus. She reached the door, her hand extending toward the heavy brass handle. The metal was cool against her palm, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the betrayal radiating from the room. Beside her, Marcus remained a silent shadow of controlled dominance. He didn't reach for the handle. He left that to her, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was her life to reclaim. As her fingers curled around the brass, she caught his eye one last time. There was no pity there, only the steady, intense energy of a man who had already made peace with the wreckage. With a slow, deliberate pressure, Elena pushed. The door swung inward on silent hinges, the narrow sliver of light expanding into a flood of warm, golden amber that spilled out into the dark corridor. The cinematic atmosphere of the room, the soft music playing from a hidden speaker, the scent of expensive lilies, the plush intimacy of the master suite, suddenly felt like a stage set for a play that had gone horribly wrong. The two figures near the bed bolted apart. The taller silhouette resolved into Julian, his crisp white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his face draining of color until he was as pale as the silk sheets behind him. The woman, his junior associate, scrambled to adjust her dress, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The intimacy that had looked so fluid through the crack in the door now appeared jagged and pathetic in the full light of day. Elena stepped into the center of the room, her light blue dress shimmering under the chandelier. She didn't scream. She didn't throw the porcelain vase sitting on the nightstand. She simply stood there, her posture upright and tense, her wide eyes taking in every detail of the room she had once considered her sanctuary. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the distant, muffled bass of the gala downstairs, a reminder of the world that still believed in Julian's lies. "Elena," Julian finally stammered, his voice cracking as he reached out a hand that she didn't take. "It's not. You weren't supposed to be up here." "I know," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, though it carried a razor-thin edge of grief. "I was supposed to be downstairs, playing the part you wrote for me." She felt Marcus step into the room behind her, his presence a heavy, undeniable weight. He didn't say a word, but as his gaze landed on his own wife, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The protective stance he had maintained in the hallway hadn't wavered. He stood beside Elena like a truth holder in a room full of ghosts. The unlocking was complete. The door was open, The light was on, and the carefully constructed facade of their lives lay in ruins on the floor. Elena looked from Julian to the woman, and then to the open door. The shock was still there, but beneath it the transformation had begun. She wasn't the woman who had climbed those stairs in fear. She was the woman who had finally walked into the light. The warm, golden light that had once seemed cinematic and inviting now felt like a harsh interrogation lamp, exposing every bead of sweat on Julian's forehead and every tremble in the associate's hands. Elena stood perfectly still, her light blue dress a cool contrast to the feverish panic radiating from her husband. She didn't need to speak. The air in the master suite was already saturated with the weight of her presence. But it was Marcus who stepped forward, assuming the role of the master of ceremonies in a theater of broken vows. He moved with a clinical, terrifyingly calm precision, walking past Elena to the center of the room. He didn't shout. He didn't rush. He simply leaned against the heavy mahogany dresser, crossing his arms with a relaxed dominance that made the room feel smaller, tighter, and entirely under his control. His eyes, narrowed and intense, never left his wife's face as she clutched a silk robe to her chest, her earlier intimacy replaced by a frantic, jagged terror. "Marcus, please, it's not what it looks like," his wife stammered, her voice a high-pitched, frantic whisper that grated against the silence. We were discussing the gala details. The noise downstairs was too much and the gala details," Marcus repeated, his voice a low, melodic rumble that carried a dangerous edge. He glanced at the unmade bed and then back to her. "I didn't realize the event planning required such a hands-on approach. Or perhaps Julian was simply showing you the version history of his marriage." Julian finally found his voice, though it was thin and lacked its usual boardroom authority. "Marcus, let's be reasonable. We can talk about this. There are reputations at stake. Think about the firm. Think about the optics." Marcus tilted his head, a small, cold smile touching his lips. "Optics? You're worried about the lighting while the house is on road? You've always been obsessed with the performance, Julian. But the thing about being a master of ceremonies is knowing when the curtain has officially fallen." He reached out and picked up a small crystal glass from the dresser, turning it over in his hand. The light caught the facets, casting tiny, dancing rainbows across the room, a mockery of the celebration happening below their feet. "You think the world downstairs still belongs to you. You think you can walk back down those stairs, fix your tie, and go back to being the golden couple. But the truth is, the audience has already seen the rehearsal." Elena watched him, her hand falling away from her mouth as she absorbed his strength. Marcus wasn't just confronting them. He was dismantling the very foundation of their excuses. Every word he spoke stripped away another layer of Julian's professional veneer, leaving him standing there, exposed, pathetic, and small. "I'm done with the script," Marcus said, setting the glass down with a final, decisive click that echoed like a gavel. He looked at Elena, his gaze shifting from cold fury to a grounded, silent support. "And I believe Elena is too. We aren't the ones who should be worried about the optics anymore. We're just the ones holding the lights." The spouses scrambled, their voices overlapping in a desperate, incoherent chorus of apologies and justifications. But Marcus simply stood his ground, the undisputed director of the scene. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The secret was no longer a weapon they held over their partners. It was a weight that was beginning to crush them. The air in the master suite was thick with the suffocating scent of lilies and ruin, But Elena no longer felt like she was choking. She turned away from the sight of Julian, a man who looked less like a titan of industry and more like a ghost inhabiting an expensive suit, and looked toward the open door. The distant, rhythmic thrum of the gala bass was calling them back, no longer a backdrop for a celebration, but the soundtrack for a reckoning. "We aren't staying here," Elena said, her voice a low, crystalline chime that cut through the spouse's frantic whispers. She didn't look back to see if they were following. She knew the gravity of Marcus's presence would pull them along like a tide. She stepped out onto the cream runner, her silver heels finding their rhythm again. Beside her, Marcus moved with a terrifyingly calm purpose, his controlled dominance acting as a shield. As they reached the top of the wooden staircase, the golden light of the grand chandelier below rose to meet them, shimmering off the thousands of crystals like a sea of glass. Elena paused for a split second at the landing, looking down at the sea of blurred faces, the silk dresses, and the polished tuxedos of the elite who thrived on the very secrets she was about to incinerate. The descent was slow, cinematic, and deliberate. Every step down the mahogany stairs felt like a reclamation of the space she had once moved through invisibly. Julian and Marcus's wife followed several paces behind, their silence heavy and jagged, trapped between the fear of a scene and the impossibility of escape. Elena could feel the eyes of the guests beginning to drift upward, drawn by the unusual sight of the host descending not with his wife, but preceded by her and a man who looked like he was leading a silent execution. The laughter in the foyer didn't stop all at once. It eroded. It started with a group of board members near the base of the stairs who noticed Julian's disheveled collar and the stark, hollow expression on his face. The hush spread like a cold front across the ballroom, moving from the bar to the dance floor until the only sound left was the sharp, rhythmic click of Elena's heels on the wooden risers. She reached the final step and stopped, her light blue dress glowing under the intense light of the foyer. She didn't seek out a microphone or make a grand announcement. She didn't have to. The optics were undeniable. She stood in a protective, upright stance beside Marcus, their shared silence a more powerful confession than any shout. Elena caught the gaze of the junior associate, who had slipped down a back staircase only moments before, now trying to blend into the crowd near the champagne tower. Elena didn't look away. She held the woman's eyes with a focused, narrowed gaze until the other woman flinched and retreated into the shadows. The social hierarchy of the room began to shift in real time. The whispers started, not about Elena's unfortunate situation, but about the sheer, icy dignity with which she was dismantling the lie. She wasn't the victim of a scandal. She was the architect of its resolution. Beside her, Marcus scanned the room, his serious, intense expression serving as a warning to anyone who thought to offer a shallow platitude. The gala was over, even if the music was still playing. Elena looked at the grand oak doors of the mansion, the exit she had once feared. Now it looked like a beginning. She began to walk toward it, Marcus at her side, leaving the wreckage of their old lives to be picked apart by the very people they had once tried so hard to impress. The cool, night air hit Elena's skin like a baptism, stripping away the stifling scent of lilies and the stagnant warmth of the gala. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the Sterling mansion remained closed, sealing in the whispers and the wreckage of the social hierarchy she had just dismantled. The muffled bass of the music was now nothing more than a faint, rhythmic heartbeat of a world that no longer had a claim on her. She walked toward the massive glass revolving doors at the edge of the circular driveway, her light blue dress fluttering in the breeze. For the first time in years, her posture wasn't a performance for the cameras or a shield against Julian's neglect. It was simply her own. She stopped just before the glass, the golden light from the mansion's entryway reflecting off the surface, creating a faint, shimmering ghost of the woman she had been when she arrived. Marcus stepped up beside her, his presence a steady, grounding force in the sudden vastness of the night. He didn't look back at the house, and he didn't check his phone for the inevitable frantic messages that were surely flooding in. He stood with his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed on the city lights twinkling in the distance. The controlled dominance he had carried throughout the night had softened into something quieter, a mutual understanding that required no further explanation. "It's going to be a long week," Marcus said, his voice a low rumble that felt more like a promise than a warning. "The lawyers, the statements, the fallout. It won't be quiet." Elena looked at the revolving doors, the glass panels slowly turning as a few other guests began to trickle out, their faces pale with the second-hand shock of the evening's revelation. She adjusted her drop earrings, the small movement no longer a nervous reflex, but a calm, deliberate action. "I'm done with quiet," Elena replied, her voice steady and clear. "I spent the last 5 years trying to be invisible so Julian could be loud. I think I'd prefer complicated for a change." Marcus turned to look at her, a shadow of a smile touching his lips, the first genuine expression she had seen on him all night. "Complicated is honest. It's a lot harder to maintain a version history of a lie than it is to just live the truth." They reached the revolving doors together. As they pushed through the glass, the transition felt like a physical shedding of their old lives. The click of Elena's silver heels on the pavement outside was sharp and final. They didn't have a plan, and they weren't the same people who had stood in that hallway staring at a smudged lip gloss or a cracked phone screen. But as they stood on the sidewalk, waiting for a car that would take them away from the sterling name and everything it represented, they weren't alone. The power dynamic had been neutralized, replaced by a raw, unscripted equality. Elena caught her reflection in the dark window of a passing car. She looked tired, her eyes still holding the weight of the betrayal, but she looked presentable. Not presentably perfect for a gala, but presentable for the start of something real. Marcus looked over at her, his intense gaze now holding a flicker of something that looked like respect. "Tomorrow?" he asked, as her car pulled up to the curb. Elena thought about the empty master suite, the lawyers, and the freedom of a name that belonged only to her. She thought about the man who had seen her at her most broken and stood beside her anyway. "Yes," she said, stepping into the car. "Tomorrow." She didn't look back as the car pulled away. She watched Marcus in the rearview mirror until he was just a silhouette against the golden glow of the mansion. A man who had helped her find the exit to a life she never should have been living. The road ahead was dark and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Elena was the one driving.